I'm Heather Arnold, and I am a history enthusiast. Used to be a local history librarian, but it's time I stopped saying that. And I'm president of the Kirrab Swamp Historical Society. So today we're looking at women and work. So last month, Jane Rivett-Carnock from the Family History Group talked about women in the home. So they will look at women at work. And of course, women have always worked. They've worked inside the home. They've worked outside the home. But you know, you sort of consider women in the past have always been employed in the house, employed for no money, of course, in the house. But today we're looking at women and work, and we'll look at some interesting websites. So I'm going to start with the websites now, and then I'll go to a PowerPoint presentation because otherwise I get a bit confused. So Michelle's going to email you the list of websites. No, so can you actually see a website here? State Library Victoria?
Yes.
Yes, okay, right. So there's various interesting websites around, and this one here I found of the on the State Library Victoria occupational registers, and it lists all the registers for professional people such as architects, hairdressers, medical practitioners, midwives, nurses. So the nurses is one we'll look at today, and I'll just click here, and it actually sends you to the state government or Victorian Government Gazette, and it tells you, I've got this one here, and if you click on that, we'll look at this registry of nurses, and there's a whole lot of, it just lists page after page after page of nurses and where they work. So this is a great resource for tracing any nurses in your family. So this is Florence Adams, and she lives in Surrey Hills, and she's actually working in Queensland. But it just goes on and on, like lots of different nurses. So that's a really great resource. And they also have a list of teachers. So if we scroll down here to the teachers, and once again, it goes to the Victorian Government Gazette. I'll just choose one at random. This one here. And you can download these gazettes, go back here and go to a few more pages. The right way up. So this here is another list of teachers. Here's Barbara Bain. She's in Milton House, Grey Street, St Kilda, and she works at the State School in Fitzroy Street, St Kilda, and tells you what divisions they are. So this is a great list of men and women who are in the teaching profession, and it just tells you, as I said, their qualifications and what schools they're at. So that's at the State Library Victoria. Other resources for teaching are the teacher records at the Public Records Office of Victoria. And they have the records of the teachers from 1863 to 1959. And I've just searched for one person here who happens to be my grandmother. So that's Vida Reid, who started teaching in 1914. She was 1917. So she was only 16. And it just tells you her the reports from the inspectors or the principals. This is she is very good when they resigned or when they were reappointed, the schools they are at, and their and that's their roll number here. So it goes through teacher after teacher after teacher, and it's quite useful to see what schools they're at and what their reports were from the inspectors. So their teaching records and nursing records. The other website we'll look at is if you have any publicans in the family. So this is a Robert Cole index, and he indexed all the publicans who had licenses of Victorian hotels from 1841 to 1949, and that's available in the State Library. You can't actually search it online, but if you go to the State Library, if you have any publicans in the family, and you should find your publican there. And the other website we'll look at is this one here, which is another State Library Victoria website, a really great one, what it used to cost. So so what houses cost, what things used to cost, and what people earn. And of course, the interesting thing here is that women, as you would know, earn much less than men. So here's the average factory worker's wage in 1910, whereas a man earned £157 per annum and a woman earned £70 per annum. Managers and clerks, the same thing. Men consistently earn more than women. So that's just a good website. You know, what houses used to cost, what other things used to cost, just to sort of, if you're doing an essay or anything on or doing some research into how people live their life, it's a good way to sort of work out a comparative cost to today of what houses cost to what other basic items cost. So they're the 4 websites that Michelle will email to you at the end of the presentation. Now I'm going to stop sharing, go back to and start sharing again. And go back to my PowerPoint presentation, and we'll go from there. Slideshow. Right, so we can all see my PowerPoint presentation. Yes, Michelle, yes, we can. Right, so women at work, these are the women at the McRobinson's factory in Fitzroy. They work. Working away in the factory, in their chocolate factory, which would have been a great place to work, I would have thought. So one of the things about women working outside the home is that obviously one of the key factors is in providing women with the skills was education. So free education came into Victoria with the Education Act of 1872, which took effect on the 1st day of January 1873, so nearly 150 years ago. And this act stipulated that schooling in Victoria should be free, secular and compulsory for children who were not less than 6 and not more than 15 years old. So I'm pretty sure before free education came in that if you had to pay for education, you'd be more likely to send your boys to school than it would be to send your girls to school. Government high school, the first government high school was a continuation school, which opened in February 1905. And then after that, there's a whole other range of other government high schools that opened, such as Ballarat, Bendigo and Sale in 1907, Shepparton and Wangaratta in 1909, Warrigal, the closest one to here, 1911, and Dandenong High School 1919. Melbourne University, of course, most people didn't go to university in those days, even the men. Melbourne University opened 1853, but did not accept women until 1881, when 4 women actually enrolled at Melbourne University. And this woman here, Bella Guerin, was the first woman to graduate from the University of Melbourne, and she was a Bachelor of Arts. So I think she did very well to be one of only 4 women at the school at that time, at the university. Other early graduates, this is from a history of PLC, Presbyterian Ladies College. Constance Ellis, who was the first woman to receive a degree of medicine. Ethel Godfrey, first woman dentist. Floss Grieg, first woman to be admitted to the bar. And on the right is Beta Goldstein, who was the first woman to stand for election to federal parliament. And it's no accident, of course, that the first graduates from Melbourne University had attended a school like Presbyterian Ladies College, which was, you know, a fee-paying school. And clearly you had to have a lot of family resources behind you to send you to a school in the first place, and secondly, to pay to go to university. So most of the early graduates from Melbourne University would have all attended private girls' schools. Of course, even when women worked, as we saw before, they didn't actually get equal pay. Equal pay came in to Victoria or Australia in 1969. And that was equal pay for equal work, but the actual pay for equal pay for equal work principle didn't actually come in until 1972. And in 1972, there was a whole lot of cases such as the physiotherapists and the speech therapists employed in the Australian public service. They were paid less than scientists in the public service. Scientists are mainly male. The physiotherapists and speech therapists are mainly female, and they put a test case to say that they had the same sort of skills required, the same knowledge of science required, the same qualifications required as the male scientists, and therefore their profession, the physios and the speech pathologists, should get paid the same as the scientists, and they actually won their case. So equal pay did come in 1969, but it's quite a few more years until actually it happened in reality. And some people still say, of course, it doesn't happen now. You've only got to consider the wages of childcare workers, just say labourers who work for the big construction sites, and the pay gap is massive. So anyway, we're not here to talk about equal pay all the time, but we'll move on from there. And then just a few resources I've already spoken about, so I'll whiz through those screens. And we'll go into nurses. So one of the main professions that women have always worked in Victoria and Australia, they've worked as nurses. And I think nursing training is interesting. It was Florence Nightingale who introduced established the world's first, in the Western world, secular school for nursing. And in Australia, most nurses were trained in hospital. So these are the nurses at the Alfred Hospital. I think it was 1890, as you can see, all well dressed. Their lovely white starched dresses. And they trained for 3 years and they worked extremely hard. This is a list of their hours here. So the hours of work in the Melbourne Hospital are from 7 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. with half an hour for lunch. The nurse has half an hour for tea. And then at 6:30, she is off duty. This is for some days. On other days, she is off from 2 till 5, but her tea time is included in that, and she has to go on duty from 5 till 9. The night nurse comes on at 9 p.m. and works until 7 a.m. Nurses get a day off once a week, or from 6:30 to 11:30 the following night. So they worked extremely long hours. I don't know how they coped. I mean, they just worked such long hours. And they got very low pay. So for the first 6 months, they actually got no pay at all. They did, of course, get their board and lodging, but they had to pay a £10 fee to start their training. This is at the Melbourne Hospital, which became the Royal Melbourne. They had to pay £10 to actually start their training, and then they got no pay for the first 6 months. Then the second 6 months, they were paid at £15, and then the second and third years during their training, £20 per annum. So the nurse actually said there was no shortage of applicants at all. And I guess the thing about being a nurse is that it often led to many other professions over the years. And it was a sort of occupation that you could start your own hospital, or you could go back to once you had married, because, of course, once you were a nurse in a public hospital, or once you had to resign when you were married. Even my mother in 1956, when she was married, she had to resign from the bank where she'd been working. So, and being a nurse, as I said, led to many other lifestyle choices or adventures, I suppose I'll call it, including the fact that they could, I can't this screen round, that they could actually serve their country and enlist for in the Australian Army nursing service during World War I. And they had to be qualified. The nurses we sent overseas were all well qualified nurses, had all done a minimum of their 3 years training, had all worked in other hospitals before. And on average, the nurses that were sent overseas were maybe, I think they're about 24, 25 years old on average, whereas the men, the soldiers who were sent overseas were only about 19 years old. So they were, as a cohort of people, they were better qualified and a lot older than the soldiers that we'd sent overseas. And these are the Army nurses who left on the Orsovo on the 17th of July, 1915. Some of the first nurses that we sent, including Aileen Lehman that we see here, and her sister Nora Lehman. And there's another girl, can't see her here. And Aileen and Nora Lehman, they had a local connection. That's Aileen here, and that's Nora here. They were the daughters of George and Kate Lehman, who had the Bridge Hotel in Dandenong, and they went to school at Dandenong. And after their parents left the hotel, they had a farm at Spring Meadows, they called it, in Cranbourne. So they had quite a connection to Cranbourne, the local area. After the war, so Aileen here, she was a younger one. She returned in 1917 because she was ill, and she married in 1917, had a son in 1919, and then her marriage broke up. And so she was left to raise her son on her own. Nora never married, so she was a single lady all her life, and she had to, so they both continued nursing after they returned home from the war. One of the first duties for Nora was that they started a small private hospital in Cranbourne to nurse all the influenza patients. So she was one of the nurses there. So they both ended up, Aileen and Nora, working for the city of St Kilda. And we know this because there is Nora here and some of her nurses in France. To think of the conditions they worked under, absolutely horrific conditions, and, and they still had to wear all the, you know, fancy white uniforms. It just astounds me. Anyway, so this is both Nora and Aileen worked for the City of St Kilda. So here she was a health inspector. So she had used her nurse, she had a well-qualified nurse, and then she got a new profession after the war, and she became a health inspector for the City of St Kilda, where she earned 228 to 240 pounds, whereas her male counterpart earned 382 pounds up to 400 pounds. So she earned about 60% of his wage for doing exactly the same job. And her sister, who was our sister Aileen Bess, she earned as a assistant nurse at the Baby Healthcare Centre 200 to 208 pounds. And interestingly enough, another female employee of the council was Miss McEldowie, who earned, who was a stenographer, who earned 240 pounds. So actually earned more than the healthcare nurses and more than Sister Lehman as the health inspector. And I suspect, I'm not denigrating what stenographers do, because that is also quite a well-trained job that you need qualifications for. But I suspect because the stenographers actually worked with the men inside and had to deal with them, and, you know, that they probably got more money because they were more visible to the men and the people in charge than the nurses and the other women who sort of didn't work so directly with all the male staff. And that could be the only reason I would have thought, because I would have thought that a nurse should have earned at least as much money as a stenographer. Well, and all the rest of the men, of course, but that's another story. So they were two local nurses who also, before they enlisted, had a small hospital in Tallangatta, a small private hospital. And another local nurse, Sister Florence Vines, also had a small private hospital, and then she enlisted in the war. So she used to run Shepton Hospital in Berwick. She started that in 1913 with Sister Dugan, and they had both graduated from Ballarat Ballarat Hospital, and were both well qualified. Florence Vines also served overseas, and when she came back from the war, she became a chiropodist, or which we now call a podiatrist. So that's an interesting sort of using her medical skills, but changing slightly the tangent of her profession. One of the things from 1901 was that nurses had to take external examinations. So trained at the hospital, but they all had to undertake the Royal Victorian Trained Nurses Association exams. And the results are often reported in the newspapers. So if you do have any nurses in your family, and you might find their name mentioned in the examination results, because they told you, often you actually get their first names as well, their Christian names, which is quite unusual to see a woman's first name in the paper. But it tells you what hospital they're at and that they'd passed their examination. So that's a really nice way to add sort of content or to your family story. And this is Sister Vines down here, and Sister Dugan, who she was in the hospital with at Berwick, and they both trained at the Ballarat Hospital. Another way that nurses could use their nursing training. Well, here, actually, I've just got a few ads here that I found randomly in the newspapers. So this is Nurse Johnson, who had a hospital at Garfield, and she visited indisposed ladies. And this one here, a private hospital in Scott Street, Dandenong, Mrs. Fink, trained nurse, and Mrs. Brockhurst, who had a hospital in Cranbourne. And once again, these are trained nurses who obviously married by their name, and they could still continue on their profession if they operated their own hospital, whereas they probably could not have been employed in a public hospital because they were married. In 1911, the Bush Nursing Hospital Service was established, and this was to provide nurses to rural communities to treat people in their own homes. So local communities could fund the cost of a nurse's salary, board and uniform, and a means of locomotion, like a horse or a car. And the salary was set by the Bush Nursing Association at the rate of £80 per annum, which is quite a good salary. And the rate of pay for a hospital nurse with 5 or 6 years experience. And the first nurse was appointed to Beach Forest in 1911. And eventually some towns also provided cottages or like small hospitals for nurses. And Kooyurup was an example of this. And their nurse Homewood, she came to cure up on the 1st of July 1918, described here in the local paper as a young-looking girl. So I don't know how young she was. She'd already been a qualified nurse and she'd already been at Owen, so she must have been well in, I would have thought, in her 30s, but she's described as a girl. So when she arrived, almost as soon as she arrived, she had to go to Delmore to treat some little boy. That was her first patient. She then went back to the Welcome to Nurse Homewood, where there was a concert on at the local hall. Refreshments were abundant and choice beside it, and choice. And a dance was held afterwards, and the company separating at 1 a.m. So you think the poor woman had just arrived in Coorup. She, had to go out to Delmore, which would have been a couple of miles, 10 Ks, to treat this little boy, come back, and then had to go to her welcome and dance till 1 o'clock. So I have to admire her stamina for that. The other traditional occupation for women was teaching. There was there's a lot of women had been, before even a lot of state schools were established, there was a raft of private schools everywhere. So the big schools such as the Academy of Mary Immaculate, which was the earliest Catholic school in Victoria, established in 1857, which of course would have been fully staffed by nuns, and that's another occupation for women, but I'm not looking at the religious side today. Presbyterian Ladies College, that I mentioned before, established 1875. Interestingly enough, Presbyterian Ladies College, even though it was a place that trained early professional women, didn't get its own female principal till I think nearly 1925, like 50 years after it started was the first female principal. Melbourne Methodist Ladies College, 1882. So there was a whole lot of these big private schools run by churches, but also a whole raft of small private schools, often run by women, and they were all throughout the suburbs. And these are just a few examples here. Oberwell Girls High School in St Kilda. At one stage, Vita Goldstein taught there. Ormiston College at Surrey Hills, the Mrs Singleton, East St Kilda Grammar School. So as you can see here, a whole raft of small private schools that operated everywhere. Once again, the life of a teacher had extremely long hours, as you would know. And this is just an example of the teaching salaries from the book Vision and Realisation, which is a centenary history of state education. And it was the salaries from 1920 to 1930. And as you can see here, the average salary for the men was, we'll just look at the first one, £195, women 140. They consistently earned more than the women did for doing exactly the same job. So one of the things about the education department was that they could earn more, women and men could earn more. They could take some time and go and teach at small rural schools where they had more responsibility and a higher pay rate. And then once they moved back to the city, if they did do that, well, then they could take a job with more responsibility and get a higher pay rate. But of course, many women, my grandma, she was the one who, she started teaching at 16 in 1917. And she didn't want to leave Melbourne and go somewhere else because she had a mother she was looking after who was quite sick. And also because being a city girl, she didn't actually want to go to the country. And one of the issues of going to the country, of course, was you had to find your own board and accommodation. And for a lot of women, and also for the men, of course, it was really quite an isolating experience to be at a small country school, being the only teacher there, being the only professional there. Men at least had probably more social freedom than women would have done. But, for women, it was just a really isolating experience. And you can understand why so many of them did not want to go to the country. This is an article from the Ovens and Murray Advertiser in 1900. And it says here, as is well known, many of these small schools are almost isolated, being some distance from any human habitation. And it seems monstrous that a delicate female should be required to place herself in a position where she could not obtain protection if she needed it. But there are a number of these schools without any quarters attached, and even if they have, the repugnance to living alone compels boarding with some neighbouring family, and in some cases, walking considerable distances to and from the schools in all weathers. It is said that one female teacher on a visit to Melbourne complained to the secretary of the department that in traversing the distance between the school and the house at which she boarded, she had to climb 5 or 6 fences and was pleasantly told that she had evidently mistaken her vocation and should go into training for hurdle racing. So, you know, there was a lot of issues for women to go to small rural schools. And there was also the fact that, you know, you had no protection, well, you had very little choice of where you would board and no protection from perhaps amorous or unwelcome advances from, you know, other family members as well. So it wasn't something every woman would have wanted to do. So this is Grandma here. She started at Gold Street Primary School, as I said, when she was 16. That's Grandma there. 1921 when she was 20. And she started off, she'd done her intermediate or Form 4 at Melbourne High School and started at Gold Street Primary School at Clifton Hill at 16, as I said. Her starting salary was 15 shillings 9 pence per week. And she left after 4 years and worked in the office of a hardware store where her fiance was the manager, and she earned £2 or 40 shillings per week. So 15 shillings she earned as a teacher, 40 shillings she earned in the office of a hardware store. Then after 2 years, she returned to teaching. She went to Thornbury State School. And after 4 years, she left because she was going to get married. And at the time of her leaving, she was earning 31 shillings per week. So still less than what she earned at the hardware store 4 years beforehand. So you can see how, you know, how low teachers' wages were, or female teachers' wages were in those days. And Grandma wasn't the only example, so we're just lucky to have this photo of Grandma there. So in at one stage, the Victorian Ladies Teachers Association was formed to help address some of these issues of pay and things like that. But oh, hang on, before we go there, we'll look at just look at this interesting one here. Another thing that women could do in schools was become the sewing mistress. So this was usually a young woman, maybe 16, maybe 18, who had left school, often a local girl, and she could become the sewing mistress. And the sewing mistress really meant that they taught the grade ones and the grade ones and the preps, but just the little ones, and they had to teach sewing to the school, to the girls. And I don't know how much they got paid, even less than the female teachers. But this article here says, in consequence of the number of girls attending the Clyde North School falling below that specified by the Education Department, Miss Elma Manx has been terminated. So essentially, she was employed to teach sewing to the girls. Because there weren't enough girls there, they sacked her. So as a token of esteem, she was given this handsome fruit set. You'd think as a token of esteem, they might have actually given her a job, but they didn't. But anyway, but that was the life of the sewing mistress in the school. If there weren't enough girls that year, well, then you were sacked. So, anyway, as I said, the Victorian Ladies Teachers Association was formed to help address some of the issues of inequality of pay, and they held a meeting in 1908, and the meeting formulated 4 demands, the first of which was that women teachers should receive equal pay for equal work. And this sort of sums up the whole life of a female teacher in some ways. We know, said several speakers, that in the eye of the department, women teachers cannot do the work of men, but they actually do it. I'm in charge today of a school with nearly 400 children, though in theory it is impossible that I should do anything of the kind, said another one of the elders. And that was indeed the reality for female teachers in the state school system. Underpaid, overworked. Just before we leave this professional occupations, in 1936 there was a, or 1937 actually, 36, there was a business and professional women's club had been established, and they held an exhibition at the Lower Melbourne Town Hall of all these different women and their different professions. And it was opened by Mrs. Norma Brooks, Dame Mabel Brooks as she later was, who started her introduction to the exhibition by saying, 30 years ago, there could not have been an exhibition like this. It would not have entered the minds of women at that time to do most of these things. And some of these women are real estate agents, ladies' wear specialists, chemists and chiropodists, a florist, a garden architect, handmade lingerie. It's a whole range of professions. And it was just an exhibition to show what women could do, which we take for granted these days. But even in 1936, it was unusual enough that they actually wrote about it in the paper. So it's perhaps not surprising that for many women, their choice of employment was to be self-employed. And lots of women were employed as hotel keepers, or had their own hotels, of course, or boarding houses or own cafes, which gave not only a source of income, but a place where they could live. And it was ideal then, of course, for a widow with children, or for a deserted wife with children, or for just single women who wanted somewhere, who just wanted a source of income. So we'll just quickly look at two of my favourite women who are hotel keepers, or interesting women. This is Mrs. Fraser, who had the license of the Pakenham Hotel, which was on the west side of Tumac Creek. And she took over the license in 1881. So she had been, her first husband was Arthur Ward, and he died in 1874 and left her with a 2-year-old and a 3-month-old baby. So you can just imagine how traumatic that would have been. He died he himself had actually kept the hotel, and then he was worked as a coach driver for Cobb & Co. And he was driving down Anthony's Cutting, if you know that, just before Bacchus Marsh. It's a very, very, very steep hill, and the brakes failed on the coach. And he had an accident, and he died a few days later. So, it just would have been absolutely traumatic for Mrs. Ward as she was then, Eliza Ward as she was then, to lose her husband with 2 little babies to look after. So after that, she then had to support herself. So she took over the license of the various hotels in the city, and then she met Alexander Fraser, with whom she had a son. So she had 3 children all up, and they had a farm at Pakenham. And then he went bankrupt. And when he went bankrupt, she took over the license of the Pakenham Hotel in 1881. He was actually quite violent towards her. And she, in 1982, she asked to have her license renewed. So every year they have to renew their license. So of course, these are often reported in the paper. So if you have a publican in the paper, it's always interesting to see, if you can find their name listed to the hotel that they own. And as you can see here, Mrs. Kay had the Gippsland Hotel, Anne Miller had the Bush Inn, which is the Cardinia Park Hotel. Mrs. Burke had Burke's Hotel, also in Pakenham. It was a very equal opportunity occupation, hotel keeping. Anyway, so she applied to get her license renewed in 1882, and the police opposed it on the grounds that the problems at the hotel were getting worse, and that 2 months ago, there was a drunken man lying outside covered in blood, apparently having been in a fight. Mrs. Fraser interfered when Mr. Fraser, her husband, kicked her and gave her a blow to the face. So this was the evidence that the police gave to say she should not have her license renewed. He didn't sort of say Mr. Fraser's a violent person who shouldn't be with her, but there was the fact that she had a drunk person lying in the yard that was the issue rather than his violence. So there was a whole lot of other objections raised by the police as why she should not get her license renewed. And her lawyer responded by answering all these objections and said, the only tenable one was her unsatisfactory marital relations with her husband, which was not misconduct on her part, but her misfortune, for which she should not be deprived of her only source of livelihood and thrown upon the world with only a few sticks of furniture to sell to enable her to commence life afresh. So she was eventually granted her license. She did struggle on, and she died in 1890, age 44. So I think she was a remarkable woman to overcome the death of her first husband, then being left with 2 little children, then married again to a man who turned out to be quite violent. And she did her best to provide herself and her family a home. My other interesting publican is Mrs. Kilroy of the Motor Club Hotel. Motor Club Hotel, of course, is the one in Cranbourne, currently known as Kelly's Hotel. And she took over the license in 1914, just for 4 years. She was there from 1914 to 1918. And she got into hotel business as her first husband. She got married in Sydney in 1887. Then they moved back to Bendigo to live with her in-laws. And then her husband left her. And after 7 years, she found out that he was living with another woman with whom he had several children. So they were living together. He was unemployed. So she started working in a hotel to support herself and him. And then he deserted her. So she had to continue to work in the hotel to support herself. And at the divorce hearing, the judge called her husband a cold-blooded scoundrel. So she was granted a divorce and married another man, a better man, it seemed, William Kilroy, and she had the license of various hotels, and as I said, Kelly's Hotel or Motor Club Hotel at Cranbourne for 4 years. And just one of the nice things she did, one of the great things she did, which made me quite fond of Gertrude, was she in 1917, she has at considerable expense obtained a most unique collection of photos of local volunteers. That is, the men from Cranbourne who enlisted to serve in World War I. And the collection was nicely arranged on the walls of the parlour of the hotel, and it's well worth an inspection. So I just thought that was really nice that she was clearly, she had no children of her own, and her husband actually enlisted to go to the war when he was 41, but he was rejected on medical grounds. But clearly a woman who wanted to get involved in the community and who they had the sentimentality to actually try to commemorate the men from the local area who'd gone overseas to serve in the war. So she's one of my favourite ones. So other women, of course, who perhaps did not want to get involved in hotels because they had the licensing issues, could open a boarding house. So this was Dandenong House, which was opened in Dandenong in 1911 and burnt down in 1978. And that was owned by Miss Matthews. It was quite a grand-looking boarding house. It was quite near the Dandenong station. So that was often run by women, men and women. So this was in, don't know what year that was, about 19, must have been just after it opened by the look of it. And then a few other slides here of other occupations that women had. And this is Miss Triggs, who was a costumery and dressmaker in Rossiter Road, Coorab. So she was a qualified woman, a person in the dressmaking business who decided to open her own small business in what was Coorab, a small country town then. And another dressmaker was Miss Lampard, who was a scientific dressmaker, and she worked at the Coffee Palace in Druin. Certified teacher of the Langer system of cutting. So once again, a woman with a special qualification, special skills, who started her own business because she probably got more money there and had more freedom. This one here, this Miss Glennon, I don't know anything much about her, but I thought it was interesting. She started a college for housekeepers, obviously trying to teach women and girls how to run a household. This is back in Coorab, the Mrs. Gallagher. The two sisters, obviously, later Warrigal, who took over the fruit and confectionery business of Mr. Colvin in Station Street. They had light refreshments at all hours. So, and this one here, this is one of my favourite, Miss Heather Mackay, who was a student of the National Confectionery College, and she had a homemade confectionery business at Yanathan of all places. I mean, it's a small place now. Must have just had a general store and a post office. But anyway, she made she obviously did catering as well, but that's another sort of occupation for a woman, that you could do catering and made fancy cakes. And this is Mrs. Byron, also in Coorab, who had a ham and beef shop, what you might call a delicatessen these days. So once again, another example of a woman who ran her own business, as there were many of them. And music teachers. So this is 1923, and Coorab, if you had a child with any musical talent, you could get lessons from Miss Williams, who was a teacher of singing and harmony theory. Lessons from Miss Johnson, who taught pianoforte theory and practice. And lessons from Miss Isabel Breeden, who taught the Italian School of Singing. So I thought that was extraordinary in a small town like Coorab, that there were three women who all advertised in a local paper that would teach your child music and singing. And this has happened, of course, all over Victoria and Australia, that most country towns would have had a singing teacher or a piano teacher or a dancing teacher or a woman who did embroidery or dressmaker. Women, of course, have also worked on farms, always worked on their family farm. And this is a photo of Mrs. McClellan, who had a farm at Lyndhurst. There was an article in 1908 in the Leader about the McClellan's dairy farm at Lyndhurst, when Lyndhurst was, of course, a country town. And they didn't actually mention her name. They mentioned her husband, who's George. Didn't actually mention her by name, but they did say, in addition to the continuous service of Mr. McClellan and his wife, the dairying absorbs hired labour costing £4 per week. So they did actually mention that Mrs. Mrs. McClellan, Margaret McClellan, also worked on the dairy farm, which is quite a rare thing because you rarely get any mention of the women's contribution to the small family farm. But she clearly was working there as an equal partner to her husband, got a photo in the paper, and actually got one little mention in the paper as well. A rare thing indeed. In 1915, the women's farm at Mordialloc was established, and this was called the Women's Rural Industries Cooperative Limited Farm. And it was established in Mordialloc by Celia John and Ina Higgins. And Cecilia had operated her own poultry farm in the Dandenongs, and Ina Higgins was the first woman to take up gardening. And they trained women to in agricultural pursuits, so they could actually work on farms or work as gardeners. So they did flower farming, vegetable growing, and other sort of things, just to teach women how to work on farms. And they supported themselves by selling their produce, well, as you can see here, at 215 La Trobe Street, or else people would go to the farm and visit the farm and buy the produce. And that's just a photo of them there. So that were operated from 2015 to 2017, 1915 to 1917. Wasn't at all very successful, which is sad because it was such a great idea. But and it had quite a lot of high profile supporters, including Beta Goldstein, who, as I said, was the first woman to stand for Parliament, and Edward Prescott, who was the principal of the School of Horticulture at Burnley, and he actually gave lectures to the women. So I did have a lot of high-profile support, but in the end, the whole idea of teaching women how to become farmers or become gardeners, it just fell by the wayside. May have been because 1917 was during the war, and there were other issues as well, or maybe the land was unsuitable. You don't really know, but great idea, but didn't work. Just while we're on training women to be farmers, my grandma, who was married 100 years ago this November, just before she got married, because my grandfather was there on the farm, she did lessons at Dookie College. Dookie College, which is the agricultural college at Dookie, just near Shepparton. They put on these lectures for women to teach them to become farmers' wives, and they'll learn things like, wheat breeding, cooking demonstrations, poultry feeding, needlework, rose pruning, fruit drying. You can see all these things here, dairy work. So all these skills that they would need to know to become the ideal farmer's wife. And Grandma took these lessons here, and there's her there. With the head, there we are, at Tynong. So she did the course there. We've got a photo of there actually as well. But it's sort of an interesting thing that once again, to become a farmer's wife, they didn't actually think these women would become farmers. They thought they would become farmers' wives. But either way, it was still good training for these women. So postmistresses. So this seems to be an occupation that was very equal opportunity, and I found a few examples of postmistresses, including another family story. Grandma, who had been to Dookie, she when she was 15, she travelled down from the train each day from Tynong down to Melbourne to go to Stotts Business College in Melbourne, and she did her training there. And then she was from late 1919 till she was married 3 years later, she was the postmistress at the Tynong Post Office. But there are other postmistresses as well. So this is Miss Coralie Reen, or Roo, who was the postmistress at Pakenham East, which is what we call Pakenham now, and she had the post office there. And in Narnagoon, Miss Edith Gissing had she was the postmistress at Narnagoon. And there's example after example after example of postmistresses who of women who are the postmark, who run the post offices, and many of them. So Patsy Adams Smith, her mother was Patsy Adams Smith, the writer. Her mother was the postmistress at Monomeath, because she they had her husband worked on the railways. They lived at the station at Monomeath, and then she actually operated the post office there as well, because so it was sometimes the postmistress in small towns was connected to the railways, because often the post office was at the railways, and sometimes they just had had a post office in town. My favourite postmistress is this poor girl here, Miss Wilkins, who in 1910, this report was in the local paper, Garfield is without a postal or telephone service owing to the breakdown of the postmistress, Miss Wilkins. Some time back, she applied for relief but was unable to get it, and second and third appeals are also unavailable. On Saturday, Miss Wilkins was forced to leave her post. So a sad thing, of course, because she clearly worked quite long hours on her own, and I got no support whatever from the post office department. So an interesting sort of job for women, but clearly long hours and no support perhaps would be a common theme in women's work. Servants. The domestic servant, of course, has always been a traditional role for girls, and the richer the household, the more servants they had. So traditionally large households may have had a cook, a housemaid, a nursemaid, a lady's maid, a laundress, and a dairymaid. Colonial girls were said to have been, as this problem here, as this says in 1867, they had the wrong attitude. The truth is that servants, especially female ones, fancied themselves above their position. In their own minds, they think they're as good as their mistresses, if not better, and they try to ape them in their dress and manners. To see a servant dressed respectably is a greater rarity as can be imagined. Dress is now so cheap that the limitations of superior articles and the imitations of superior articles so excellent, the servants can and do dress in a manner that is not only ridiculous but disgusting. So how dare these girls dress as they want to do? So these colonial girls had the wrong attitude to be a servant, so they often imported or bought out girls from England who knew their place to be servants. But these well-trained girls were often snapped up because they were, if they were well-trained in as a dairymaid or as a housemaid, they were snapped up to be good wives. They were well-trained wives. So women in Australia found it hard to get a servant. Hard to import a servant because they were immediately snapped up to be a wife of someone, and so many colonial households only had the one servant who was called a general. So she had a general role rather than a specific role, and this just adds everywhere for servants. This one here, there has to be Protestant. Not unusual to see no Irish. There was a lot of sectarianism, as you may know, in Australia's history, and personal references required. And there's also adds under general and under girls. Girl here, 13 and useful, a 13-year-old girl. I can't imagine a poor girl son of 13 as a house, as a servant. And this one here, girl respectable, 14 or 15. You hardly think she would have had time to become unrespectable, but she had to be not only young, she had to be respectable as well. So, it was hard for and they advertised by saying no children or no washing or those sort of things, I think, to encourage the girls to apply, because the working as a servant was extremely long hours, extremely poor pay, and also quite isolating. If they lived at home, if they lived in the home, they were often, the only young girl there. So they were quite isolated from their friends, and they worked very long hours. And they also had to put up with the advances perhaps of other, not always of course, but sometimes of male members of the family who'd considered them sort of like a bit of easy prey. So there was a commission. For many of these sort of reasons, many of these girls who may have worked as servants decided to go and start working in factories because they had shorter hours and better pay. But there was, this is a great photo here. These maids who worked for Madame Strawn, Strawn, of Creswick, circa 1890. They all look like about 13. And this girl obviously does the washing. This girl here's clean shoes or whatever she's doing, and this girl here's peeling potatoes. But they look, very young, and I presume they're happy, but you'd have to wonder whether they would have been. So in 1911, so because of all these conditions in working in homes, a lot of girls decided to work in factories because they had more freedom and they got more money. So in 1911, there was a Royal Commission on Labour in New South Wales under Mr. Piddington, and he was looking into conditions of factory employees. And this woman here, May Ouch, she was a stemmer at the Australian Tobacco Factory, and she talked about her experience there, and she was really happy in a factory because she said that she used to work in a boarding house where she worked from 6:30 until 4:30 without ceasing. She had an hour's, half an hour spell, and then had to go upstairs and lay 5 tables and work till 10 p.m. So she essentially worked from 6 o'clock till 10 p.m. every day. She had 3 nights up and every second Sunday and received 12 shillings a week. Working in the factory, she could receive 30 shillings a week, so more than double her pay. And because obviously there's a bit of piecework involved, she at one stage made £2, which is 40 shillings a week. So she found that, working in the factory was a much better job. And she also said that she used to work in private service as a private home, where she worked from 7:15 until 2:30, then from 5:30 until 7:30, and the rest of the time she was free. So she considered that she was better off working in the factory. She could save money. Her and her sister rented a room and lived together, and she received a hot meal from the factory, which she was very happy with. So she herself was extremely happy working in the factory. It wasn't, of course, always like that, because I interviewed another woman, Emily McIntosh, who worked in the same factory, and she had a lot more complaints. She said that there was a lot of heat, there was a lot of dust. And interestingly enough, her last comment was that, questioned by Mr. Piddington as to the character of factory girls, she said, Emily said, she'd often seen girls fighting in the old days. Some of the girls, even now, were what she described as a bit wrong morally. So which brings us, of course, to the moral issue. And many people thought, there's this letter here to the Herald in 1885, who said, thought that that a life in the factory leads girls to immorality and ruin of both themselves and with whom they associate. There are thousands of homes in this colony willing and waiting for the services of young girls, where they would be carefully trained, well treated, and have comfortable homes as domestic servants. Why would these girls be allowed to become a curse to the community when such demand exists for domestic servants? So he goes on and on about that, about how there's too many temptations working in a factory, and they should work as a domestic servant, where they would be, better treated, and it would not lead to immorality and ruin. However, it seems like in the end, many girls preferred factory life because they could work with girls their own wage, so they had companionship, and they earned better money, they had shorter hours, and for many of them, they might have thought that, because as our girl before, May, who said, basically she said that there was working in the home, the job just never ended, it was never done, it never ended, it was never done. And she wanted, and it gave her freedom working in a factory, and she probably thought, May, that she could take care of her own morality and she didn't have to need to be told about it by any old bloke. So that's a short history of women and work, and thank you for listening.